Although the endearing rascal Dennis enchanted America on screen, no one anticipated the mayhem that occurred behind the scenes. What appeared to be a straightforward, family-friendly sitcom turned out to be a volatile mix of conflict, accidents, and emotional outbursts. Dennis the Menace was far from a simple story, with forgotten mishaps, overworked kid actors, and cast members quietly suffering off camera. And one dangerous gamble was the beginning of it all. A choice that would make a child famous and set Jay North on a path of decline that would follow him for the rest of his life. The system is ugly and terrible. Its administrators are ruthless. They lack empathy. During the heyday of American television, when clean children's shows and family comedy dominated prime time, a new concept started to take root at CBS. A family sitcom with the purity of Leave It to Beaver but with more energy and mischief was what the network was looking for. The solution was a television show based on Dennis the Menace, a comic strip by Hank Ketcham. With its mischievous youngster in overalls, slingshot in pocket, and a smile that portended disaster for his unfortunate neighbor, Mr. Wilson, the cartoon had already attracted the attention of newspaper readers. However, it was harder than anticipated to make a comic strip come to life on television. A nice face wasn't enough for the studio. To carry a full series, they needed a kid who was crazy, cute, and had the perfect amount of charm. Numerous young actors were taken under consideration. Paradoxically, Jay North, who would eventually land the part, was fired first. Executives said he was too restrained, too quiet, and possibly too well-behaved. However, Screen Gems studio executives came to a realization. A prefabricated child celebrity was not what they desired. They desired someone new, someone under their authority. Their blank slate was Jay North's soft-spoken demeanor and big eyes. Even though he was only 6 years old, he was being thrust into the spotlight without his will. His legal guardians, his aunt and uncle, wanted him to be successful. Their lucky charm appeared to be Dennis the Menace. After Jay was cast, production swiftly increased. Scripts were completed, sets were constructed, and the tone was deliberately chosen to complement the comic strip's lighthearted mayhem. Enjoyable for children, sentimental for adults. However, fissures had already begun to appear before the cameras rolled. Jay wasn't a boisterous person by nature. He was a shy and reserved child off camera who liked to be left alone rather than start a fight. It was disregarded by the producers. As long as Jay was able to make Dennis come to life on screen, his comfort level was irrelevant. Nobody understood that there would be a price for constantly pushing a youngster so far from his true self. Despite Dennis the Menace's picture-perfect appearance, a little child was already being drawn into something much bigger than himself. When Jay North rose to fame, he was just 6 years old. He possessed the face that casting directors coveted on paper. A cherubic smile, bright eyes, and just the perfect amount of mischief to suit the part. However, the youngster who never wanted any of it was hidden beneath the smile. Jay had no aspirations of becoming famous. Quiet and reserved, he was happiest when he was by himself with a book or a sketchbook. But in an instant, he became America's most famous youngster, Dennis the Menace. From the beginning, Jay was confined to a role that didn't feel like him. Dennis was wild and vivacious on screen. Jay was a sensitive and reclusive person off-screen who found it difficult to comprehend why he had to act in a certain way. However, the pressure was constant and the camera was rolling. Since the network had placed a large wager on the show's success, Dennis, that is, Jay, was not permitted to have a bad day. His aunt and uncle, who served as his guardians, oversaw every aspect of his early years. They were in charge of managing his career, reputation, and earnings in addition to providing for his medical needs. Jay subsequently characterized them as emotionally aloof and inflexible. There was little support. There was hardly any comfort, and it was strictly forbidden to show signs of tension or annoyance. Jay was not allowed to be a child in a society where child performers were regarded as miniature pros. He was reprimanded if he failed to remember a line. He was instructed to persevere if he appeared exhausted. There were no pauses for concern or developing pains. Whether he wanted to or not, Jay had to deliver, and the Dennis character had to be the star. The fissures soon became visible. Between takes, Jay grew quieter and frequently avoided making eye contact or remained by himself. On television, he continued to make jokes, but off camera, the actual child was becoming more and more withdrawn. Some could see the change, but few were brave enough to voice it. The most painful thing was how isolated he felt. Dennis was admired by many, but few stopped to inquire about Jay's coping mechanisms. No one appeared to realize that the show was progressively crushing him, even if he was its face. And the environment around him started to change into something even harder to survive as the pressure increased. The set of Dennis the Menace appeared to spectators at home to be a picture-perfect representation of suburban life. Every show featured immaculate kitchens, well-kept lawns, and happy family times. The truth behind the camera, however, was much less appealing. What appeared to be freewheeling enjoyment on screen was actually a highly tense, carefully controlled situation. It wasn't just Jay North who felt it. There was limited room for error because the entire production followed a rigid schedule. Directors wanted accuracy. Lines were supposed to be delivered word for word by the writers. Adult expectations were placed on even the youngest cast members. It was discouraged to improvise. Consistency trumped originality, and few people risked to break the rules behind the scenes. This rigidity was enforced in part by Jay's guardians. They stayed by his side all the time, monitoring his performance and keeping a tight eye out for any deviations. They had a strained relationship with the production team. Arguments erupted over Jay's actions, his weariness, or his increasing uneasiness. The mood was described as walking on eggshell by one crew member. The pressure was physical as well as mental. In one instance, a prop malfunctioned and almost hurt a crew member. Although the incident was discreetly hushed up, many people were concerned about it. Production could not afford to be delayed, much less embroiled in controversy. Keeping the concert on schedule takes precedence above safety concerns. Over time, rumors of long hours, worn-out young actors, and silent concerns of speaking up started to circulate. The joyful mayhem depicted on TV was carefully planned and controlled. It was not impulsive in any way. Everything was meticulously planned to satisfy network requirements. Even Jay's close friends and family members saw how alone he was growing, yet few intervened. It was discouraged by the studio culture. Jay was not viewed as a suffering kid, but rather as the main character, the brand, and the product. Additionally, the distance between the on-screen illusion and reality grew with each successive episode. The show was nonetheless successful, though. The ratings remained high. No one watching at home realized how shaky the production had become, and fan mail continued to pour in. Everything changed the day a cherished cast member permanently disappeared. Without Mr. Wilson, Dennis the Menace would not have been the same for millions of fans. One of the most recognizable characters on the show was the sour yet endearing neighbor, who was often annoyed by Dennis's naive mayhem. Joseph Carnes performed the part flawlessly. His reactions were priceless, his timing was impeccable, and there was no denying his chemistry with young Jay North. Beneath his humorous annoyance, however, was a guy silently struggling with a much more important issue than a mealsome child. Without giving followers any notice, Joseph Carnes left in February 1962. The official announcement was swift. He had suffered a brain hemorrhage and died abruptly. Both the crowd and the performers were taken aback by the announcement. While those on set were devastated by the abrupt departure of the actor who had been the center of the show's adult ensemble, viewers lamented Mr. Wilson's passing. However, not many were aware that Carnes had been battling health problems for several months. The production schedule continued despite rumors that he had previously passed out on set. During the last weeks of filming, friends said he was dropping weight quickly and looked more and more worn out. The network, however, has no intention of slowing down. There were strict deadlines and high ratings, but Carnes, ever the professional, refused to disappoint anyone. The defeat was more than just a setback for Jay North's career. It was intimate. Carnes had been one of the few adults in the cast who had been kind to him. Carnes treated Jay like a real child, in contrast to others who viewed him as a product or performance tool. He listened to him, made jokes with him, and even made an effort to lessen the pressure at the beginning where he could. Jay described Carnes as a kind person who helped to make everything seem less frightening. The producers of the show made fast adjustments. A few episodes later, they added a new character, Gale Gordon, as Mr. Wilson's brother, John Wilson, to keep the plot going. Despite Gordon's experience as a performer, the change felt abrupt. Behind the scenes, the adjustment merely heightened the discomfort that fans felt was lacking. There was no place to think, no time to mourn. Work had resumed. On-camera smiles, hidden sorrow. Since then, Carnes's dying circumstances have been quietly criticized. Some people think that his illness might have gotten worse as a result of his hectic schedule. Others believe that he was just too devoted and refused to admit his weakness or seek assistance. In any case, the cast and crew saw a sea change after his death. Mr. Wilson's passing left a vacuum in the show's structure that could never be fully filled by recasting or ratings. It served as a reminder to Jay that even those who seemed secure could vanish at any time. Additionally, the remaining vestiges of childhood comfort were rapidly disappearing as the demands of celebrity continued to rise. However, there was still one person on set who would jeopardize her career to try to protect him from everything. Gloria Henry portrayed the ideal mother on screen. She was kind, patient, and always prepared to give Dennis a kind reprimand or a loving grin when he misbehaved. Although she perfectly embodied the stereotypical 1960s television matriarch, Gloria was far from the submissive housewife her character represented offscreen. She was actually one of the few who was prepared to speak up when she spotted wrongdoing, and she was deeply upset by what she'd seen behind the scenes. With years of acting experience under her belt, Gloria joined Dennis the Menace and immediately recognized the difference in the atmosphere. The tone was extremely professional, the energy was inflexible, and the unwritten rule was obvious. Don't question the system. However, Gloria had keen intuition, and she quickly became uneasy about the way Jay North was being treated. She could see how the young kid was under increasing pressure, how his guardians hovered like watchdogs rather than protectors, and how terror filled his eyes when he erred. Gloria made an effort to provide Jay with a secure environment right away. She tried to engage with him in between scenes, providing light chat and encouragement, while others avoided him. Sometimes it was as easy as simply telling him he did a nice job or sitting next to him during lunch breaks. Later, Jay claimed that the only times he ever felt like a person instead of a character were during those few moments with Gloria. However, the superiors did not overlook Gloria's efforts, and not in a positive way. She received criticism for challenging some of the scripts that made Dennis the target of increasingly offensive jokes. Producers warned her to cease meddling and reminded her of her role. She allegedly once heard that if she persisted in resisting, her role may be completely wiped out. It was a well-thought-out threat that almost succeeded. But she refused to give up. Gloria refused to keep quiet about her belief that Jay was being gradually broken by the show. She could at least act as a buffer, refusing to turn a blind eye when a child was under stress, even if she was powerless to alter the system. Even though her lobbying was mild, it had an impact. Gloria Henry was one of the few individuals on site who truly showed Jay North kindness, as he would later acknowledge. Her influence contributed to a few little advancements over time. Scripts became softer. Even while the setting was still demanding, Jay was allowed a little more break in between takes, and at least one adult did not treat him like a product. Decades later, in interviews, Jay spoke passionately about Gloria's support, describing her as the only person who truly cared about my feelings. However, the harm was already being done despite her silent opposition. It was hard to conceal Jay's fatigue as the show's last season drew closer. He wasn't simply exhausted anymore. He was falling apart. And he was suddenly being surrounded by the very fame that had made him a star. The collapse was imminent. And no one was prepared when it happened. The signals were unmistakable by the time Dennis the Menace entered its last season. Jay North wasn't simply having trouble. He was barely hanging on. What had started out as a gradual loss of happiness had developed into intense emotional tiredness. Fans no longer loved the cheerful, bouncing youngster. Instead, he had grown silent, aloof, and reclusive. Those closest to him were also either hesitant or unable to step in behind the scenes. Even though Jay was only 11 years old, he had already experienced more stress than most adults. As the show's success skyrocketed, its expectations only increased. Longer filming days, more promotional appearances, and mounting expectations that he would play Dennis both on and off screen were all part of the situation. He was urged to always remain in character, paraded in front of supporters, and flown throughout the nation to attend events. Later, former cast members and crew would remember how different he had become, despite his tiredness, illness, and pleas for a break. He stopped making jokes in between takes. He hardly ever talked to other kids. On certain days, he would cry in private in his dressing room, praying no one would hear, but the cameras would still record. As the actual youngster vanished in silence, Jay subsequently compared those years to being imprisoned inside a character that the world adored. It was all made worse by his sense of loneliness. His guardians and producers saw his increasing withdrawal as a sign of attitude or lack of professionalism. Instead of providing assistance, they intensified their efforts. He was urged to quit whining, to be thankful, and to get in shape. According to reports, his guardians, who served as both his caregivers and business managers, wrote off his emotions as immaturity. Instead of concentrating on the boy beneath the brand, they were more concerned with the money, the contracts, and the upcoming season. Jay was so stressed at one point that he started purposefully ruining takes in the hopes that he would get a relief from making the same mistakes over and over again. Rather, it led to increased pressure and reprimands. He was said to be challenging. As a matter of fact, he was anxious for someone to realize that he was unraveling. The toll was not limited to the set. Jay received distinct treatment at school. His classmates viewed him as a celebrity rather than a classmate. He had a hard time making friends. He claimed to have received preferential treatment from teachers, which only made him feel more alienated. He once claimed that he felt as though he was living in two different worlds, one where no one really knew him and the other where he was revered by strangers. The show's creators started looking for new ideas as the last season came to an end. The ratings had dropped a little. The character's charm was eroding as Dennis grew older. Jay, however, was not relieved. He felt abandoned. The finale came with silence rather than jubilation after years of bearing the weight of a whole production. There were no arrangements to help him transition back into normal life, no therapy, and no meaningful farewells. The spotlight just went out. Jay North was left all alone, vulnerable, well-known, and utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. However, his version of the tale would eventually be told to the world years later. Even his most devoted fans were taken aback by what he disclosed. Jay North left the public eye nearly as soon as he had come when Dennis the Menace concluded in 1963. In addition to making him famous, the show had robbed him of almost everything. His early years, his faith in grown-ups, and for a while, even his sense of self. Jay found himself in a bind without the routine of filming every day and the continual pressure to perform. He lacked a clear strategy, direction, and an understanding of what it meant to be a typical adolescent. Jay tried to carry on acting in the ensuing years, but the industry had already given him a label. He would always be Dennis in the eyes of casting directors. And that label was a cage to Jay. As a young adult, he found it almost impossible to get meaningful roles or be considered seriously. He was now unable to break free from the joyous mischief that had previously made him America's favorite troublemaker. His mental health declined along with his profession. Jay struggled with severe despair, loneliness, and an increasing feeling that he had been taken advantage of and abandoned. He stopped communicating with almost everyone from his past for a while. Later on, he acknowledged that he battled feelings of wrath, bewilderment, and prolonged stillness during which he would just block out the outside world. The damage remained, but the celebrity was gone. Jay North didn't start speaking out until many years later, well into adulthood. He disclosed the entire scope of his suffering while filming Dennis the Menace in sporadic interviews in the 1980s and 1990s. He spoke candidly about the emotional abuse he suffered, the total absence of any safeguards or assistance, and the lasting wounds caused by the ordeal. Many of his admirers, who had grown up idolizing him, were stunned by his statements because they were unvarnished, vulnerable, and brutally honest. Jay acknowledged in a very candid interview that he had considered suicide once while he was in his teens. He felt invisible to those who were meant to look after him, and the pressure had grown intolerable. The only reason he survived was because of the help of a close friend. It was a pivotal experience that drove him to pursue genuine healing. Jay North had a completely different existence as an adult. He gave up acting and turned to campaigning for fulfillment. He worked with organizations that sought to keep others from experiencing what he had, and he became a fervent advocate for child actor protection laws. Additionally, he discovered meaning in structure and duty while working as a correctional officer, a profession very different from Hollywood. In retrospect, Jay has stated that he feels no animosity toward the fans. He knows that Dennis was adored by many. The fact that so few people ever inquired about Jay still aches. The tale of Dennis the Menace is regarded as a delightful example of vintage television today. However, for those who dig deeper, it serves as a warning, a reminder that sometimes the spotlight shines brighter than anyone can see. A youngster who was never destined to be a celebrity but was yet made into one is at the heart of that tale.